and the maker of the Scaling Up Scoreboard. And so I want to welcome you to our monthly coach webinar for May 2020. This morning, we are thrilled to have Coach Andy Clayton with us with a presentation on how to conduct a successful strategic planning session with our remote teams, something that obviously many of us may be thinking about and experiencing for the first time as we start thinking about and planning our Q3 strategic quarterly planning sessions. For those of you who are not familiar with Andy, he is a UK-based speaker, author, entrepreneur, scaling up certified business coach, and the head of Petra Coach's European operations. Prior to his coaching practice, Andy successfully grew and developed his agency business in China, past the $10 million mark before successfully exiting the business and selling it to his largest competitor. He now works to help other entrepreneurs master those same habits that brought him success through coaching and by serving as one of the most senior trainers in the Entrepreneurs Organization, or EO as we probably all know it. Andy also just published his first book entitled Sweet Spot: How to Spend More Time Doing What You Love, Are Good At, and Adds Most Value. As always, before we begin, one administrative note. We want this to be as educational and informational for all of you as possible. So please do not hesitate to ask questions, but please do so via the Zoom chat feature. And we will be sure to present all of those questions to Andy at the conclusion of his presentation and try to answer as many of those as we can. Again, thank you for attending this Align Coach webinar, and I will now turn the microphone and the presentation over to Andy. Hi, Andy. Nice to see you.
Hi, Eugene. It's great to see you. Thank you very much. What a wonderful introduction. I sometimes wonder if it's me you're introducing. You know, it sounds like someone else sometimes. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to present to you this afternoon. And as Eugene shared, I'm a Petra Coach, which means that I help companies to align their teams in order to get their strategies and plans in place so that they can unlock growth. Now, a lot has changed in the past few weeks and months. And so I'm going to share with you some of the stories of what our members have been doing, how we've had to adapt the strategy and the planning so that you can see some of the outcomes that they're getting, and also then break it down into the how, getting a little bit more specific around the steps that were taken in order to deliver some of these outcomes. And I want to start with a story. So this is a company that we started working with a couple of months ago. They're based here in the UK, and they're called SaaStock. So they're one of the two leading events companies for the software as a service industry. Now, we were quite concerned when they started with us, or were about to start with us back in March, because we thought at that time, wow, an events business, surely this is going to be really challenging. You know, there's probably a good chance that they won't start with us, and you know, we might lose this as an engagement. However, their CEO, Alex, who I credit really with being a very, very bold and visionary guy, he used this period, this difficult transition, this crisis, as a chance to accelerate change within his business. And it's a really nice story of a company taking a very, very bold pivot. So I'm going to break it down a little bit for you to understand what they did and the outcomes that they've gotten. So SaaStock have been going for about 5-6 years, and it's one of those, a guy started it in his own basement type stories. And like all the rest of us, he's been through his fair share of ups and downs, and he's had years of turnover growth and years of profitability growth. And by the beginning of this year, he's top 2 in his industry globally as a team of about 20 or 30 people, and really recognized as being the best player in their industry, particularly for smaller local SaaS related events. And then March 2020 came along, and obviously, you know, it was a crisis, a terrible crisis for their industry. One by one, all the events got cancelled, and it was right about the time when we started with them to do their strategy and planning. And so what Alex did is they were the first business in their industry to actually pivot to creating a virtual event. So this is called SaaStock Remote. It's planned for next month. Now, what I like about this story is several things. Firstly, when they decided to make this pivot, we spent a lot of time actually on the planning of the how to it. And then when they started releasing information to the market, their competitors very quickly started to copy. I'm going to come onto this in a minute, but they recognized the opportunity in the change and the shift that had happened within this industry. So in a situation where a lot of people would have been, I think, very fearful of events getting cancelled, losing revenue, and they very much took the mindset of viewing it as an opportunity. Now, obviously, completely turning a business around is a very challenging thing to do. You've got, like I say, 20, 30 people, and they all now need to be aligned in a completely new direction, doing something that the business hasn't done before. So to share with you where they're at now, with about a month to go to the event, their margin rates now are 3 times what they were in the old world. Now they had to rationalize certain parts of the business in order to get there and cut a few costs. But obviously doing things virtually has a better margin rate. And they're 70% sold through to this event. So they're right on track for their sales target for hitting this event. So it's fantastic to be able to see that a business can take a really bold pivot like this and still manage to create a better business on the back of it. So I want to share with you and break it down a little bit, like how that was achieved in a practical sense. And I want to start really at the very high end of the leadership and the mindset and the mentality, particularly from Alex and the top leadership team. And when I observed what Alex was doing, and I saw other companies in the space, not just in events, but across a wide range of industries, moving quickly in this way, it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. And what I realized is the mindset of guys like that is what I would call a land grab. So the world suddenly changed overnight. People moved to finding information online, buying services online, having to deliver their services online. And that's very, very disruptive. It's probably one of the most single disruptive economic moments in history. And so what that does is it opens up new territory. So for example, when I think of my business, the way that people use and search for and purchase my services has suddenly really changed. So how do I position myself as being an expert in this new world? And so I found this question of what's the land grab in your business to be very, very helpful and valuable. And so let me give you a quick example. So another one of our members, they are in the furniture space. So they sell furniture to large corporations who have big offices and need to fit out all of their furniture. Now, obviously that's a very, that market has shrunk right down. So where's the land grab in their situation? And so the leadership team of that business have realized that a lot of companies, what they now need to do is they've got teams working from home, but they still have a responsibility of providing effective workspaces and safe workspaces for those people. So they have to be able to provide furniture to their staff working from home. So they are developing or tweaking a platform, an online purchase platform that they previously had, in order to provide a portal for corporate customers buying furniture for people at home, because it's a little bit different. When you have your own office, you can control all the colors and the sizes and everything matches together. But when people are buying for their own homes, you have to have like a corporate account, but also be able to provide all the selection that people would have in more of a retail environment. So it's again, it's a pivot. It's taking all the advantages of the existing business model, taking one bit of it, changing it, and adapting that to the new model. So I would suggest for you to think about that in terms of land grab. I just think that's a very, very positive, expansive way of thinking about sudden change in marketplace. The second sort of observation from a leadership point of view that I do see recently is that CEOs have had to be a little bit more CEO-ish than historically. Now, there is still a lot of work being done on aligning people, but in a situation where people are moving really fast, I see like firstly, the pace of decision having to be a little bit quicker, maybe a little bit less consensus. So certainly when Alex was looking at the change in SaaStock, there was pushback from the team. There were people thinking, oh, well, I'm not sure if this is going to work. And it was one of those situations where the CEO kind of had to override the team to a certain extent and still be vindicated at the end of it. So I think it is a time, particularly for CEOs, to have the courage of their convictions, to lead from in front in a way that I normally wouldn't be advising or suggesting people to do, and maybe do things in a slightly more step-by-step and consultative way. So let's break down the kind of the how of it. How is it that these companies are going from the mindset of seeing that there is opportunity to then turning that into more specific plans? And this is where we get into the practicalities of virtual strategy and planning. So we are a coaching company that use all of the habits from scaling up. So if you're interested and engaged with Align, then I assume that you've had some kind of familiarity already with scaling up. So the tools of scaling up is what we have found to be the best sort of single tome and volume for the how-to of putting together strategy and planning for high growth mid-sized companies. So a lot of the terminology that you'll hear me use and the tools that I reference, a lot of it you can trace back to scaling up. Now, some of it is sort of original to scaling up, but a lot of it is really, it's like what we call a book of books. It brings together all of the ideas and best practices that you might have read from, you know, Jim Collins and Peter Drucker and all the sort of good thinkers around about the place, and just puts it into a nice, clear, easy to use manual for particularly for CEOs and leadership teams of high growth mid-sized companies. So first of all, a little bit on the how of it. So if you haven't done so already in your business, if you're a mid-sized company and you're thinking, where's next? How do we pivot? What do we do with the business? Now, the initial sort of panic stage of the whole coronavirus thing has kind of settled down, certainly here in Europe. And people are now reaching that stage of having to set direction. So planning windows have gone from a day to a week to a few weeks to now we can get back to thinking about, okay, what we know roughly what things will look like in a couple of months' time. We can set objectives and set plans for those. So now really is the time to put the time in the diary, put the date in the diary for the next company planning and strategy session. Now, a lot of people have some anxiety around that at the moment, because you think, well, does that really work virtually? You know, the teams, they're all working from home. Can we effectively set strategy when people are in that environment? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes, you absolutely can. In fact, virtual strategy and planning has some advantages over doing it in person. So for example, you can be much more flexible in terms of the timings of things. So if you're all getting together physically for a planning meeting, it kind of bookends things in a slightly restrictive way. But when you're virtual, you can do a half day followed by a half day. You can have a check-in after a month. You can reduce your planning window to just being 2 months and 3 months with really no change in the cost base. So that you can bring in people that otherwise maybe you need to bring in an expert to give some training on how to do recruitment or whatever part of the business is that you require. And so it really does have advantages on doing it in the virtual world. But obviously there are some tools and techniques that you need to figure out to do that. It's a great time to get people reacquainted and educated with scaling up. And so two of my sort of takeaway suggestions, and I've actually built a whole DIY course on how to do this virtual planning. But one is, think about somebody in the team to be the facilitator of your virtual planning session. So that's the person that, with you, assuming you're the CEO of the business, works to put together and lead the agenda of the day. Now, I always suggest it's better to have that person not be the CEO, because the CEO, if you're wearing these two hats of both guiding the process and being the facilitator of the day, and ultimately being the decision maker of the content of the day, that creates a tension and unhealthy dynamic. So if you can find somebody within the team that's good at sort of structure and process and moderating people through any debate and discussion they might have, it's great to have somebody in the team to own that for you and make sure that you get through the agenda on time. And the second role that's very, very helpful to have in a virtual planning and strategy day is somebody to moderate the technology. So there are kind of three key platforms that they need to get familiar with. So if you're the CEO, you appoint those two people in those two roles, you can then sit back and participate in the day and make decisions and get things done as necessary. So let's targets and metrics for the business. These are all sort of important things to be changed. Now, core stuff like your core values and your core purpose, these, assuming you have those in place, they're not really going to have changed significantly, but it's more that sort of midterm tactical stuff around annual initiatives, maybe the 2 to 3 year thrusts and capabilities. You are going to have to allocate some degree of time to work on those. And then obviously the key value of strategy and a strategy and planning day is then referencing the strategies that you have in order to drive the priorities for the upcoming period. So you set the period, maybe it's 2 months, maybe it's 3 months, and it's a process of working with the team to drive out what are the few key things that we need to focus on and change in the next period. So for example, taking Ken's business, the furniture business just now, clearly one of their priorities is to get this online platform up and running, to test it. So you can set a target. You say, right, where do we need to be with that by September? So it's all about setting objectives. And the planning section of the day is working back and figuring out, based on those milestones, what do we need to do and get done in order to get there. And then the execution is the detailed planning of the actions around that. So let me just take a few examples for each of these 4 sections of the day of what that means. So from the strategy, a very commonly used sort of tool and visual aid for this is this idea of having a Behag. Now, for a lot of companies, it won't necessarily have changed your Behag. Maybe it has. It really depends on kind of how much the tectonic plates of your industry have shifted as a result of the recent crisis. For a lot of companies, their Behag will sort of remain changed and untouched. Some of them, maybe the world has changed enough. But it's this idea of having a very clear vision for the future, maybe 10 or 20 years hence, of what your business looks like, and then breaking down the steps to how we get there. So what I see with a lot of our members at the moment is that particularly this sort of 1 year, 3 year initiatives, key initiatives, some of those have changed out of necessity given what's happened. Another example of a key tool from strategy is the brand promise. And I think this is an area that I personally really enjoy working with teams on. So brand promise is this idea that every company, based on their core customers and the niche, the sandbox in which they operate, they have to have a few key points of differentiation. So something which their core customers require and need, so maybe a pain or a gain that they solve, that they can repeatedly deliver every single time. And I want to share with you a couple of examples from companies that we work with. And the first one is a business based in London called Third Way. And what they do is they do the design and building out of office space. So brand promise is very much in the realm of positioning. So what's the positioning of the business? How is it unique? What's the particular advantage that that business brings? What's the area that you're competing on versus other companies? So if you do office design and build out, there's all sorts of ways that you can compete on that. You know, you can be the quickest at fit out. You can obviously compete on cost. But a lot of companies, it's about sort of the aesthetics of the design, or maybe you cater to a certain industry, or you work in a certain part of town and you've got the local knowledge there. Now these guys, the way that they compete is quite interesting. It's what they call total engagement. And what that means is that their offices are all designed around the people using them. So they've spent an awful lot of time and effort and energy understanding how people use offices. And they've got these sort of 22 different avatars for how people, particularly in the London market, use offices, such as how much Wi-Fi do they need? How much office space does each one require? How do they get to work? And so when they design an office, the first thing they go and do is to interview and understand the people using it, and then based around that, because their sell, their pitch to their customers is, if you want engagement from your team members, then we are the best choice to provide higher engagement. And this is just yesterday, I was on LinkedIn, and Ben Gillam is the CEO of Third Way. And this is a post that he made. So just to give you a sense of kind of how deep the brand promise needs to run and how consistent that needs to be in the organization, if you take a minute just to read through what Ben is saying there, he's talking about how COVID-19 and the whole crisis has affected people's views towards workspace. And he's saying that there's really one thing that hasn't changed, which is workspace is all about the people using it. So you can see there's a very sort of clear differentiation, a philosophy, if you will, of what the positioning of that business is all about, that sits at the heart of it. Right, then getting on to planning. So we've got our strategies set up. planning is really all about driving focus in a particular period. Companies get stuck and they stand still if they don't have a few key initiatives that the team are all pointed in the same direction. I remember a few years ago, I started working with a company up in Finland, a food business. And one of the key sort of metrics of success in that industry was about constantly launching new products. And they hadn't launched a new product in 3 years. And simply the reason was because they kept having different ideas, and they were going to make a bar and a soup and a this and a that. And the net result was no new products. And so when we really sort of drilled down and focused, right, there needs to be collected, concerted, consistent effort on this same idea for a protracted period. Within 2 months, they were back to launching 1 new product per month. And that has allowed them to get back in the black and build that business back to profitability. So it's this idea of making the main thing the main thing. And the kind of terminology that we use for that within scaling up, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with this, is this idea of creating a few key rocks. So if you want to make a change in the business, unless you're very deliberate about the planning and setting of those priorities, you'll just get overwhelmed by day-to-day work. So sand being day-to-day work, rock being a few priorities. If you want to fit it all in, the only way to do it is to put the rocks first. And so to give you a practical sort of example of what that looks like, you'll all be familiar with this. This is obviously a screenshot from Align. And Align is a really, really strong tool for recording those priorities. So you set what those priorities are. You can do it with the outcomes of those priorities for KPIs, and also for the tasks that roll up in order to decide the success and the completion of that KPI. So we use this tool with a lot of our member companies in order to set what their priorities are, and then during the quarter to track and follow the progress. So I had a call just this morning with one of our members in the Middle East, and they're all working towards their key priorities. They're making great progress, and they're using this tool in order to make sure it's tracked. And then making sure from an execution point of view that you've got good communication rhythms. Now this is this has had to change a little bit in recent times. So we've updated our communication standards in our business. We have a daily huddle every morning now at 7:44. And because it's a virtual world, these kind of regular communication check-in rhythms have become so much more important because there's no chance bumping into one another anymore. So we find that super helpful. 7:44, we get on the call, we say, what are our key priorities for today? We check in as a team, we see each other, we share if there's places where we're stuck. And so those good execution rhythms, if anything, have become all the more important. So from a technology point of view, and this is one thing that a lot of people feel a bit of anxiety about, is, well, okay, we know a bit about how strategy and planning works. We've read Scaling Up, maybe we used to do strategy and planning. How to actually do it virtually? And this is where some of the technology pieces come into play. And there's really 3 key software technologies that you have to master in order to be able to do strategy and planning effectively online. The first one is you need a good piece of conference calling software. Now we use Zoom, and some of our teams use Teams, and they both have quite overlapping similar functionality, but I'll share mostly around Zoom. And there's a few functions within that that are absolutely vital. One being breakouts. If you have a team of more than about sort of 4 or 5 people, when it comes to the actual setting of priorities, a lot of that requires quite detailed discussion where you have to put teams into groups and then have them go away and plan out the details of a particular priority. Now you can actually do that in Zoom. It's got a function called breakouts. So if you've got 3 priorities and you've got 15 people, you can break them into 3 groups of 5 and put them away into their own room on the conference call for 5 minutes. And you know what? It's actually more effective, we have found, than doing it in person. There's several reasons for that. Firstly, there's none of the faffing around of, are you going here? Am I going there? And shifting of chairs. You just press the button and they get immediately shoved into that group. So it's actually more time efficient. The second is that it has a timer. So if you're setting people 20 minutes to get an activity done, they can see that clock ticking. And what I found is that the timekeeping element of breakout work in planning sessions has improved online because of that one simple function. The second piece of technology that you have to master is some form of virtual whiteboard. Now the screenshot here is from a platform called Miro. There are several out there. You've got Mural, Stormboard, Google's got one I think called Jamboard, and they'll do a fairly similar thing, which is this kind of infinite virtual whiteboard where you can put frames, boxes, text box, sticky notes. You can even put tables in there. You can also copy and paste things from any other document. So for example, if you've got targets and metrics for the quarter, you can screenshot those, copy them, paste them into your whiteboard. And then what this is super helpful for is the kind of part of the day where people are brainstorming around what priorities need to be. So this is an example here. It's one that I've made up, so it's actually from a real company, where people are brainstorming where they see the priorities of the business needing to be. And you can see sort of 3 key priorities emerge on the left-hand side where there's overlap and alignment from the team of what they think needs to get done. So it's very, very helpful for that collaborative brainstorming parts of the day. And then the third thing, of course, is you need somewhere to record the output. Like you need a digital platform. It's not enough to just get stuff into flip charts and notebooks. It has to be recorded into software. And this is where platforms like Align really come into their own in a virtual planning context, because you can get it all up there. It's all real time, and you can see the outputs and the plans and the tasks that people are sharing. So I would strongly encourage you to get back to the good habits and practices of strategy and planning. It's absolutely doable in the virtual alignment, and it brings back all the benefits that we're familiar with. We've got to get teams aligned behind whatever new direction. So whatever the pivot is for your business, it's so important that the team are involved in the setting of that direction. And whether you're doing it in a more directive way or you're involving the team, either way, everybody needs to be consistently aligned behind what the new direction of the business is. And then you have to have priorities in order to map out how we're going to get there. And it's only if we do that that we're going to get our companies back to growth. There are also helpful, valuable skills for the team to learn, figuring out all of these tools for the virtual world. I don't know about you, but I found a lot of this stuff's even been helpful in a family environment where I'm sort of leading family treasure hunts across all sorts of different people. So these are very helpful and beneficial tools to be mastering. So that's about the end of what I've prepared for you today, but I'm more than happy to take questions on what we've discussed.
Thank you so much, Andy. For those of you that have questions, please use the chat. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Henry Joyce, who's going to handle the Q&A section.
All right. So thank you to all of those who submitted questions ahead of time. And again, feel free to continue sending in stuff via the chat or Q&A. So to start off, the first question that we had was around who should be involved in remote planning. And, maybe before it was easy to toss everyone in a room, but now there's complexity when you add more people to video calls. So who should be involved in the strategic planning session?
Yeah, that's a great question. So normally the way that we would divide it is you'd have like the strategic leadership team. So that's, C-suite people, anybody that maybe the board, anybody that's involved in the setting of strategic direction, involved in the strategy set parts of the day. And then we have a distinction with what we call the execution team. So the execution team is more the people that would be involved in the planning of initiatives and projects and priorities in order to realize that strategy. And the overlap being, so what I see quite commonly now is, whereas previously you might have a whole day of quarterly planning, you can now break it quite comfortably into 2 half days. And maybe you've got the strategic leadership team for the whole half day or the first 2 hours, and then you bring in the execution team. And again, this is one of the advantages of doing things in the virtual world. So we have a few teams where they have the half day followed by a half day because they don't want to take an entire day out of people's working day. But one of the advantages of virtual is that you can bring people in as and when needed. Or you can say to people, look, I want you to put a placeholder for the whole day, but we might only need you for 2 hours. But the short answer is I do see a little bit more of the kind of executive decision making, if you want, done by smaller leadership teams right now. A little bit less involvement with the wider execution team when it comes to setting of direction, because people want to move fast and pivot quickly. But they still are moving to having the wider execution team involved when it comes to the planning. Now, taking the example of SaaStock there, Alex, I mean, we led on that day, there was more than 20 people on the virtual planning day, and it worked. I mean, it's quite hard work, and you need to have somebody pretty skilled with the breakout groups to make that work. But the breakouts were tremendously effective, because there you're breaking people down into sort of a workable group of 3, 4, 5 people where they're actually talking about a specific project. But yeah, so the answer now is similar to what it's always been. When you talk about strategy, you need to have the the leaders, the thinking members of the organization there to set direction, bring in the wider execution team when it comes to planning out individual priorities.
Great. So there's also some questions around how to keep planning sessions interactive and participants engaged throughout the day. I mean, I think, Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So we're all figuring out how to keep these sessions, so people are continuing to generate good ideas. And you talked about breakout rooms, but maybe some other strategies you might have.
So the ground rules and the sort of meeting hygiene online is a little bit different from virtually. So the first one is make sure you do the whole thing video on. You absolutely cannot have people who you can't see. And a lot of what we're doing now is actually to require the speaker to be on as well. So unless there's a lot of background noise, so we create it as close to what you'd use in a real-time environment. So definitely videos on, and it is actually quite good to keep the mute off unless people have got background noise. The next one is you have to enforce people to switch off anything that's distracting. So when we do in-person meetings, we go around with a box and we take away people's mobile phones because they're just so tempting. And you have to do the same kind of hygiene in a virtual environment. So I say to people, go switch off your email, don't just close it, but actually quit the mail program. Do the same with social media and switch off any browsers that aren't directly required for this, especially social media, news, anything like that. And because otherwise, things are going ping and people are getting very readily distracted. The next one is you've got to take breaks at least every hour. People get very, very drained, surprisingly drained online. So we've had to, normally we keep going maybe for 90 minutes, but now it's 45 minutes to an hour. We're stopping 5 to 10 minutes. And even when we do that, at the end of it, people are saying, oh God, we wish we'd had more breaks, And then every time you come back, you then have to remind people again to switch off all the distracting things. A lot of fun little icebreakers to keep the day fun and engaging are really important. So my favorite one recently, I always come up with good icebreakers when I'm in the shower. I was in the shower the other day, I thought, I got one person say, give me a year in the past 10 years. And then another person give me a month, another person give me a day. And so they're like 4th of April, 2012. All right, I want everyone to go into your photos and find the closest photo from that day and share it with us and tell us where you were that day and what you were doing. Or common ones recently, where's the first restaurant that you're going to go when we come out of lockdown? And there's a whole bunch of fun little icebreakers where you quickly go around the room and have a check-in and make people feel that they're doing something fun and engaging in addition to the draining work stuff.
Another question comes from, I think there's some people in industries that feel very stuck and there isn't a clear pathway to return and they're suffering revenue loss. So do you have some questions that can kind of begin to expand thinking, brainstorming, to get the team to think about where those potential land grabs could be?
Yeah, that's a really good and a very important question. So I think it's important to recognize at the outset that there are some companies for whom the best thing to do is to sit this out. And so we've had a few members that initially were a little bit sort of stuck in the headlights because it's a fearful thing that's happened. And so there has to be a rigorous process of looking at the numbers and whether a pivot would be something that's feasible for that business. So for example, we were at the dermatology clinic and there was time spent thinking, could we deliver online dermatology classes and these sorts of things, but it would never have been enough to cover the shortfall. So the only thing to do is, put staff on furlough, shut up shop, reduce the costs and essentially shutter the business for a while. And for a lot of companies, that has to be a strategy. Obviously, I hear a lot of speakers and coaches talking at length about opportunity. The problem with too much of that is it gives people a false sense of hope and security in a situation which for a lot of companies is genuinely quite bleak. Having said all that, there is opportunity to be found. And really it's partly where you are on that spectrum of industries. So if an events business, which is obviously hugely disruptive, can figure it out, then if you're an airline, then it's a little bit more challenging, right? So it really is quite industry specific. The single most helpful question I have found is that one around land grab, and typically there's 4 areas in which the world has changed and there's opportunity to sort of access new territory. One is how do they find you? everybody at the moment is investing a lot of time and effort and energy, particularly into digital, online, social media, content-driven marketing. So you see people with blog posts and events, and all of that is a response to the fact that the way that people are finding information about companies has suddenly and fundamentally changed. So the way that you communicate with the market, are there opportunities for attracting customers maybe on a global basis? So for example, we have a client that we work with here based out of Oxford, and they're the world's leading consultancy on diversity and inclusivity. So they're all psychologists, and they help organizations to reduce unfairness and bias in the workplace. And so they would traditionally do these like breakfast meeting seminar events, and they would get 20, 30 people come up, and they'd have a certain number of people that would sign up. Now they're doing online webinars, and they have 100 people sign up. And the reason is because they can tap a global market. It's as simple as that. You know, they're actually finding growth through adversity, through the simple thing of accessing customers online and virtually in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do before, because people wouldn't have gone online to find someone like them. So that's the first area, is like how people find you. The second is like, how do people actually buy from you? So for example, I've doing some work recently with a company that make all the materials that you need in order to, it sounds a bit off the wall, but it's for cannabis, for like how you actually grow and transport cannabis, which is legitimate these days. It's not my thing, but it's a thing. And previously people would go to a shop to buy those things, whereas now all those shops are closed. So what that means is that there's a land grab going on for what's the sales channel that people are going to use to acquire, because they still want to buy that product. So someone somewhere in that industry is going to have the website that everyone's going to go to. So as a supplier, you think, well, do I own that website? Do I partner with that website? And it's a question of figuring out the new channel. But there is, again, a land grab going on there. The third is kind of service delivery. So in my world, in terms of what I do, my service delivery has had to shift from in-person to virtual. And that's true for a lot of service-based businesses. And again, that can have advantages. I mean, I've been kicking off and starting work with companies around the world in a way that, you know, if anything, capacity has kind of increased because of the virtual world. And the final thing is like, how do people, what's changed in their world that might be a new need that they have? So again, for example, in our business, people now need to know how to do these things virtually. It was an opportunity to demonstrate expertise that wasn't there before. So if you think across and work and brainstorm those 4 areas, so what's changed in our company, in our customers' world, what's changed in how they found us, what's changed in how they buy from us, and what's changed in how we actually deliver our products or services, you will find something that is new. Now, if it's enough to actually, you know, keep the business afloat, it kind of depends on the industry that you're at. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but I hope that.
No, great answer. So another question that had come up was around creating the kind of bonds and the trust that I think are important to successful face-to-face planning sessions, and how to recreate that kind of trust when you're in the virtual world.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And my team has been virtual since the inception of the company a few years ago. And many of my best friends and some of our customers have always had virtual teams. So from our perspective, you know, that's never really been an issue. Now, okay, maybe we have selected for people in our businesses that are comfortable working in that kind of environment in the first place. However, I've never really seen an impediment to, certainly for a service business like ours, to running virtually. So we're very familiar and used to doing a lot of kind of like fun online, sometimes kind of goofball sorts of games, like the photo one that I shared with you just now, whereby you are spending time sort of socially with each other in a way that isn't quite so structured. And that works. I mean, I guess it's personal preference, but for me, that works fine in a virtual. Now, a few things that I do see some of our companies doing. The first one is a lot of our clients now are thinking about never going back to their offices. And I don't know if this is a trend that you guys are seeing, but they are either closing up their offices entirely, or, you know, canceled expansions, or they're just going to slim down, and there may be certain teams that have to do stuff in person. But I see a lot of teams around the world are kind of permanently moving to being virtual. So what are the ways that people do it? So one of our customers, what they do is their office, when you go into the office, it has this kind of kitchen bar area where people naturally congregate. So when they go to make a cup of tea or something stronger, that's where they go. So what they've done is, I think it's every Tuesday and Thursday, they open for certain hours during the day. It's not that area physically, but they have what they call like the virtual kitchen, where people could just check in any time. And there's no agenda to it. It's if they're not doing something else, they can just hook up with other team members, simply to sort of sit around the water cooler or the kitchen as they would do in a physical environment. So there are a bunch of things that you can do, but clearly this is something that a lot of people are going to have to get comfortable with in the world going forward.
We have a question around reacting to a situation where there was a Zoom session and it was attacked. So I guess kind of more broadly, how can leaders manage situations like this, or say where you have a tech meltdown? How can they adjust and adapt to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very real issue and a very practical thing. And the answer to it is it in the same way in the old world, as business leaders, we would know a lot of the details around picking office furniture, for example, or the kind of router that we'd have in the office or the telephone system. Like, we would know the details of the physical infrastructure that we would use. The same now has to be true in the virtual environment. And what that means is you have to really get to know Zoom in a level of detail that you wouldn't previously have felt necessary. So what that means, I mean, I have a whole checklist for Zoom settings that I'm constantly updating based on the kind of meeting that I'm having. And we really are having to get into that level of detail. So you can set a waiting room, right, where people have to kind of sign in and check in, and you can set all the security levels within that. And like I say, to a degree that we otherwise wouldn't have comfortably, or we wouldn't have considered necessary. So I haven't experienced that personally, but I have really spent time getting into the details of all the sort of virtual platforms that we're using in order to, because it's kind of on me to make sure that from a technology point of view, things run smoothly. But if you think about the cost of these things, right? So whatever it costs to get the right account and the security settings around it, it's so, one of the guys I was on an event with recently, Daniel, he had previously 6 or 7 offices around the world. He's now slimmed that down to 3 so that he covers the 3 main time zones of the world. So his office costs have gone from sort of, 75 grand a month to 1,500, and the 1,500 is, just Zoom accounts. So it's an order of magnitude less than we would spend, but it does mean we'd obviously need to spend on the details and the right kind of accounts and the security in those sorts of platforms.
Can you talk a little bit more about the do-it-yourself strategic plan that you had mentioned?
Right. So the world has changed for people. People are quite cash constrained at the moment. They have to get back to planning and get their teams aligned, and they have to figure out how to do it virtually. So I put these together and I thought, right, well, people need some help at the moment. And I created an online DIY course. And it's really taking all the ideas that I've shared today, such as what a moderator needs to do, what a facilitator needs to do, and builds each one of those out into sort of 5 to 10 minute videos with all the worksheets and the checklists that you need to do. So that's there. It's available. I can share the link, or Eugene could share the link afterwards with his blessing. But yeah, I've built this little course. It's made at home just to set expectations, but it has all the details that are required that you need in order to really get into, and really what it's intended for is so that when you allocate that person to be a facilitator and moderator, so they can go and learn all the tools that they need to do the day effectively.
Great. I guess one final question. So are there any other aspects of in-person face-to-face planning that you think are at critical risk that we could lose out on, and how to make sure we can identify those and adjust accordingly?
So what's the one thing that you lose the most? Is it from
transition? Are there other things that are critical to successful planning that can be lost from losing the face-to-face? and, you know, for instance, how to make sure that everyone participates and stays engaged.
Right. So you do have to be, because it's hard to sort of talk and see everyone and their reactions at the same time. So you have to be a little bit more prescriptive around, okay, now it's your turn and your turn and your turn, and make sure that everybody speaks up, because you won't get those non-verbal cues that people will otherwise give. So it's much harder to measure engagement. So you sort of have to assume, in a sense, less engagement, and therefore compensate by taking more breaks, by doing more sort of icebreakers, by calling on people more often. Otherwise, the experience of sitting on the receiving end can be quite disengaging. So yes, you do have to compensate for that. Otherwise, but it's honestly, I would leave you with a message of hope, which is that it's genuinely doable. You can get all the same outcomes, and you can get a lot of benefits from it. Not just the cost-saving benefits, although that is a big one. But there's a certain efficiency of time and a flexibility around doing things virtually that has advantages. And it's no coincidence, I don't think, people come away from a virtual planning session at least as exhausted as they do doing it in person. And it's because it's absolutely possible to keep people engaged throughout the full day.
Andy, thank you very much. Just as an anecdote, I will share that the Align team, when we were doing our Q2 planning in the middle, towards the end of March, after COVID had really sort of started, we did a virtual planning session since we were all working from home and remote. And many of our employees said that it was one of the most efficient planning sessions that we had ever done, more so than even when we did them in person. And like you suggested, we obviously were all on Zoom. We had breakout rooms that we implemented in order to do the detailed work in trying to figure out our quarterly priorities. And yes, it was, you know, exhausting, but it was part of the exercise, and it actually ran fairly smoothly. I think everyone's voices were heard, and I'm obviously will be doing the same thing when we start doing our Q3 planning session in the next few weeks. I want to thank everybody for attending today's Coach webinar, and certainly a huge thank you to Andy for a great presentation. If you have any questions about how to use the Align or the Scaling Up Scoreboard software as part of your remote or virtual planning session, please don't hesitate to contact your Align advisor directly or email us at support@aligntoday.com. You can also email Andy directly if you have follow-up questions at andyclayton@petracoach.com. Also, I hope that you have seen some of our Align Daily Dose of Advice videos, of which Andy was actually a recent guest on, and also presented some great content about doing emotional and fear inventories as we work through the COVID crisis. If you are not, we encourage you to like and follow Align on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Also, if you're on here and you are a business coach or a CEO that has an interesting story or some feedback or insights that you think you would like to share as part of a guest on the Daily Dose of Advice videos, please don't hesitate to contact me at eterk@aligntoday.com. We're always looking for interesting content, so please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you again. We hope you will join us next month for our next Coach webinar. Till then, we hope you have a great day, and please stay safe. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Eugene.